It usually starts with something very small, almost invisible, a moment most people would ignore without even realizing it mattered. Someone walks into a room, and while others see just a person, a careful observer notices posture, hesitation, tone, timing, even silence. And in that quiet act of noticing, an entirely different layer of reality reveals itself. Observation, when understood deeply, is not just about seeing more. It is about seeing differently. Most people move through life on autopilot, reacting instead of perceiving, assuming instead of understanding. They believe they are aware, but in truth, they are only skimming the surface of their surroundings. The real power lies in training the mind to slow down just enough to catch what others miss. At its core, observation begins with attention. Not scattered attention, not distracted awareness, but a deliberate and focused presence. The kind where you are fully engaged with what is in front of you. When you speak to someone, you are not thinking about your reply. When you walk into a place, you are not lost in your phone. You are there, completely. This alone creates a dramatic shift. Because the moment attention sharpens, patterns begin to emerge. You start noticing inconsistencies, the mismatch between words and expressions, between actions and intentions. You begin to understand that people rarely communicate only through language. In fact, most of what matters is said without words. One of the deeper techniques hidden within observation is learning to separate what is obvious from what is essential. The obvious is loud, easy, and often misleading. It is what everyone sees. But the essential is quiet. It hides in subtle details, a slight pause before answering, a forced smile, a repeated behavior that doesn't quite fit the situation. When you train yourself to look beyond the obvious, you begin to access insights that others simply don't have. You understand people better, situations clearer, and outcomes more accurately. This is not guesswork or intuition in a mystical sense. It is a skill, one that can be practiced and refined. Another layer unfolds when you realize that observation is not only about others. It is equally about yourself. Most people are strangers to their own patterns. They don't notice how they react under pressure, how their emotions shift their decisions, or how their habits shape their outcomes. Without this awareness, change becomes almost impossible. But when you start observing yourself with the same clarity you apply to others, something powerful happens. You begin to catch your own impulses in real time. You notice when you are about to make a poor decision. You see the emotional triggers that influence your behavior. And slowly, you gain control, not by force, but by understanding. There is also a quiet discipline involved here. True observation requires patience. It asks you to resist the urge to jump to conclusions, to sit with uncertainty a little longer, to gather more context before forming an opinion. In a world that rewards quick reactions, this can feel uncomfortable at first. But it is precisely this pause that creates depth. Over time, this practice sharpens your perception in ways that feel almost effortless. You start reading environments quickly. You understand dynamics in a room without needing explanations. You sense shifts before they become visible to others. And perhaps most importantly, you stop being easily misled. Because when you truly observe, you are no longer dependent on what people say or what appears on the surface. You rely on patterns, consistency, and subtle signals. This makes you harder to deceive and more capable of making sound decisions. But there is a hidden challenge here that many overlook. As your observation improves, you may begin to see things you didn't notice before, contradictions in people, flaws in systems, even uncomfortable truths about your own life. This can be unsettling. It requires a certain level of emotional strength to accept reality as it is, not as you wish it to be. And this is where observation transforms from a simple skill into a form of quiet intelligence. It is not just about collecting information, but about interpreting it wisely. About knowing what matters and what doesn't. About choosing when to act and when to simply watch. Interestingly, the more you develop this ability, the less you feel the need to prove anything. You become more measured, more thoughtful. You speak less, but with greater clarity. Because you are no longer reacting impulsively, you are responding with awareness. This shift doesn't happen overnight. It builds gradually, through small moments of conscious attention. Through choosing. Don't realize is that observation alone is not enough. There are deeper techniques, subtle adjustments in how you see, how you interpret, and how you connect information, that take this skill to an entirely different level. And once you understand those, the way you experience everyday situations begins to change in ways that feel almost surprising. That's where things start to get truly interesting. If you pay close attention, you'll notice that most people don't actually see what's happening around them, they see what they expect to see. Their past experiences, beliefs, and assumptions quietly filter reality before it even reaches conscious awareness. And this is where observation begins to deepen into something far more powerful than simple noticing. Because once you understand that perception is biased, you start to question your own first impressions. There is a subtle technique hidden here, the ability to pause your judgment. Not eliminate it completely, but delay it just enough to gather more information. This small shift changes everything. Instead of reacting instantly, you begin to explore. Instead of labeling a situation too quickly, you allow it to unfold. Imagine meeting someone new. Most people form an opinion within seconds, based on appearance, tone, or a single sentence. But a trained observer holds back. They watch how the person behaves over time. They notice consistency, or the lack of it. They pay attention to how this person treats others, not just how they present themselves. This creates a more accurate understanding, one that is grounded in patterns rather than impressions. And patterns are where the real insights live. A single action can be misleading. Anyone can act out of character once, but repeated behavior tells a story. It reveals priorities, habits, and underlying intentions. When you start focusing on patterns instead of isolated moments, people become much easier to understand. This applies not only to individuals, but to situations as well. In business, relationships, or everyday life, outcomes are rarely random. They follow patterns, sometimes obvious, sometimes hidden. The ability to detect these patterns early gives you a quiet advantage. You begin to anticipate rather than react. There's also a deeper layer to this technique. It involves shifting your focus from what is happening to why it is happening. Most people stop at the surface. They describe events, but they don't explore causes. A careful observer goes further. If someone is consistently late, the surface explanation is simple: they lack punctuality. But a deeper look might reveal something else. Poor time management, avoidance behavior, lack of respect, or even hidden stress. The behavior is just the visible outcome of something deeper. When you train your mind to ask why, without rushing to answer it, you begin to uncover motivations. And once you understand motivations, predicting behavior becomes much easier. But there is a balance to maintain here. Overanalyzing every small detail can lead to confusion rather than clarity. The goal is not to become paranoid or overly suspicious. It is to develop a calm, steady awareness, one that observes without forcing conclusions. This is where emotional control becomes essential. Your emotions can either sharpen your observation or completely distort it. When you are angry, you see threats. When you are insecure, you see judgment. When you are overly excited, you may ignore warning signs. In each case, your internal state shapes your external perception. A disciplined observer learns to separate emotion from observation, not by suppressing feelings, but by recognizing them. You notice what you feel, but you don't let it dictate what you see. This creates clarity. For example, in a disagreement, most people listen only to respond. Their focus is on defending their position, not understanding the other person. But if you shift into observation mode, you begin to notice tone, word choice, hesitation, and underlying emotion. You understand not just what is being said, but what is being felt. And that changes how you respond. You become less reactive, more thoughtful. Instead of escalating situations, you navigate them. Instead of taking things personally, you see them objectively. This alone can transform relationships in a very practical way. There is another quiet technique embedded in all of this: learning to observe without being noticed. Not in a manipulative or secretive sense, but in a natural, unobtrusive way. When people feel watched, they change their behavior. They become guarded, performative, less authentic. But when they feel comfortable, they reveal their true patterns. So the skill lies: gather more accurate information. Over time, this ability builds a kind of quiet confidence. You no longer feel the need to rush decisions or react impulsively. You trust your understanding because it is based on careful observation, not assumptions. At the same time, something interesting begins to happen internally. As you become better at observing others, you also become more aware of how others might be observing you. You start noticing your own patterns more clearly, your habits, your reactions, your blind spots. This can be uncomfortable at first, but it is also incredibly valuable. Because awareness creates choice. Once you see your own patterns, you are no longer controlled by them in the same way. You can adjust, refine, and improve. You can choose how you respond instead of acting automatically. This is where observation turns into personal growth. And yet, even with all of this, there is still one layer that many people never reach. It's not about seeing more details or understanding more patterns. It's about knowing where to direct your observation in the first place. Because attention is limited, you cannot observe everything at once. What you choose to focus on determines what you understand, and what you completely miss. And mastering that choice is what separates casual observers from those who truly see what others don't. What most people don't realize is that observation is not just about how sharp your eyes are, but about where you choose to place them. Attention is limited, and in a world overflowing with noise, distractions, and constant movement, the real skill lies in deciding what deserves your focus and what doesn't. Because if you try to notice everything, you end up understanding nothing. This is where the final layer of observation begins to take shape, the ability to filter reality intelligently. Not by ignoring things blindly, but by consciously directing your awareness toward what truly matters. It's a quiet shift, but it changes how you experience almost every situation. Think about walking into a busy environment. There are dozens of conversations, movements, sounds, and visual cues happening all at once. Most people either get overwhelmed or they tune out completely. But a trained observer does something different. They don't try to capture everything. They select a few meaningful signals and follow them closely. This selection is not random. It is guided by intent. If your goal is to understand people, you focus on behavior, tone, and interaction. If your goal is to understand an environment, you focus on structure, flow, and patterns of movement. If your goal is to make better decisions, you focus on consistency, consequences, and underlying incentives. In other words, observation becomes purposeful. Without purpose, attention drifts. It gets pulled toward whatever is loudest, most emotional, or most immediately stimulating. And often, those things are the least important. They demand attention, but they don't provide insight. A calm observer learns to resist that pull. They don't chase every distraction. They don't react to every signal. Instead, they develop a kind of internal compass, a sense of what is worth noticing and what can be ignored. This doesn't mean they miss things. It means they prioritize wisely. And over time, this creates a deeper level of clarity. You begin to notice that the most important information is rarely the most obvious. It doesn't announce itself loudly. It sits quietly in the background, in repeated behaviors, in subtle inconsistencies, in small details that others overlook because they seem insignificant. For example, in a professional setting, most people pay attention to what is being said in meetings. But a careful observer also notices what is not being said. Who avoids certain topics? Who agrees too quickly? Who speaks confidently but lacks follow-through later? These small observations reveal more than the surface-level conversation ever could. The same applies in personal life. Words can be crafted, controlled, and sometimes misleading. But patterns, tone, and timing are much harder to fake consistently. When you learn to focus on these elements, your understanding becomes more grounded in reality. There is also an important discipline involved in letting go of irrelevant details. Not everything you notice needs to be analyzed or remembered. Holding on to too much information creates mental clutter. It slows down your thinking and makes decision-making harder. So part of mastering observation is learning what to discard. This is not about carelessness. It is about efficiency. You acknowledge information, but you don't give it unnecessary weight. You allow it to. People judge situations based on short-term impressions, but deeper understanding comes from watching how things evolve. How does a person behave under pressure versus comfort? How does a system respond to stress? How do decisions play out over time? These longer arcs reveal truths that short snapshots cannot. And this is where patience becomes one of the most valuable qualities in observation. Not passive waiting, but active awareness over time. You stay engaged, you keep noticing, but you allow patterns to fully form before drawing conclusions. This patience protects you from one of the biggest mistakes people make, acting on incomplete information. When you rush to conclusions, you often miss context. You misinterpret intentions. You make decisions that feel right in the moment but prove flawed later. But when you give yourself time to observe properly, your decisions become more accurate and more stable. There is also a quiet confidence that develops here. You no longer feel pressured to have immediate answers. You are comfortable saying, "I need to see more." This alone sets you apart in a world that often values speed over accuracy. At the same time, your awareness becomes more refined. You don't just notice more, you notice better. You pick up on the signals that truly matter. You understand situations with less effort because your mind knows where to look. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to trust your perception. Not blindly, but with a grounded sense of confidence that comes from practice. You've seen patterns before. You've tested your observations against reality. You've learned from mistakes. And this experience sharpens your judgment in a way that cannot be taught quickly. In the end, observation is not a single skill. It is a combination of attention, patience, emotional control, pattern recognition, and intentional focus. When these elements come together, they create a way of seeing the world that is both calm and powerful. You move through situations with greater awareness. You understand people more clearly. You make decisions with more certainty. And all of this happens quietly, without drawing attention, without needing validation. It becomes part of how you think. And once you reach this point, something subtle but important changes. You stop trying to force outcomes. Instead, you position yourself better. You see opportunities earlier. You avoid unnecessary risks. You respond rather than react. It doesn't make life perfect, but it makes it far more navigable. And that is the real power hidden within After a certain point, observation stops feeling like a technique and starts becoming part of your natural thinking. You no longer remind yourself to pay attention, you simply do. And yet, this is also where a subtle danger appears, one that can quietly weaken everything you've built if you are not careful. Because the more you observe, the easier it becomes to believe that seeing is enough. It isn't. There is a gap between noticing something and using that insight effectively. Many people develop sharp awareness, but they hesitate when it comes to acting on what they see. They gather information, they understand patterns, but they stay passive. And over time, this creates frustration, because clarity without action doesn't change outcomes. So the next layer is not about observing more, but about integrating what you observe into how you behave. This requires judgment. Not quick, emotional judgment, but thoughtful decision making based on patterns you've consistently seen. For example, if you've observed that someone repeatedly avoids responsibility, the insight itself is not enough. The real value comes from adjusting how much you rely on them. If you notice a pattern of poor follow-through in a system or process, the insight matters only when it influences your choices moving forward. Observation, in this sense, becomes a tool for positioning yourself better in reality. And this is where many people struggle, not because they lack awareness, but because they doubt their own conclusions. They second-guess what they've seen. They override their observations with hope, emotion, or external pressure. You might notice warning signs in a situation, but convince yourself you are overthinking. You might see inconsistency in someone's behavior, but ignore it because it's uncomfortable to confront. In both cases, the problem is not observation, it's the unwillingness to trust it. Developing trust in your perception takes time. It comes from testing it, refining it, and occasionally being wrong. Because you will be wrong sometimes. No matter how sharp your observation becomes, it will never be perfect. But that's not the goal. The goal is to be directionally accurate more often than not. To reduce blind spots. To make better decisions over time, even if some of them don't work out exactly as expected. When you accept this, you stop chasing perfection and start focusing on consistency. There is also an important balance between observation and action. Acting too quickly can lead to mistakes, but waiting too long can cause missed opportunities. A skilled observer learns to recognize when enough information has been gathered. This moment is not always obvious. It requires a sense of timing. Sometimes the pattern is clear early, and waiting longer adds no value. Other times, the situation is still unfolding, and premature action can lead to poor outcomes. The ability to distinguish between these moments is what separates thoughtful decision-making from hesitation. And this ability improves with experience. As you continue observing, you begin to recognize familiar patterns more quickly. Situations that once felt complex start to feel more predictable. Not because they are simple, but because you've seen similar dynamics before. This creates a quiet efficiency in your thinking. You don't need to analyze everything from scratch. You draw from memory, from past observations, from patterns that have repeated enough times to become recognizable. This allows you to move faster without becoming careless. At the same time, there is a need to stay flexible. One of the risks of becoming a strong observer is becoming too certain. You start believing your interpretations are always correct. You rely heavily on past patterns and assume they will always apply. But reality is not always consistent. People change, context shifts, new variables appear. So while patterns are powerful, they are not absolute. A grounded observer keeps a level of openness. You trust your observations, but you remain willing to update them when new information appears. You don't cling to conclusions simply because they felt right at one point. This balance, confidence without rigidity, is what keeps your observation sharp over time. There is also a deeper, more personal dimension that emerges here. As your awareness grows, you begin to see not just external patterns, but internal ones with greater clarity. You notice how your own thinking evolves, how your biases influence what you choose to focus on, how your past experiences shape your interpretations. And this awareness allows you to refine not just what you observe, but how you observe. You become more intentional about your perspective. Awareness start working together. You are not just reacting to the world, you are engaging with it consciously. Your decisions reflect both what you see and how you think about what you see. And over time, this leads to a quieter, more stable form of confidence. Not the kind that needs to prove itself, but the kind that comes from understanding. You don't feel the need to rush, to force outcomes, or to control everything. You focus on positioning yourself well, making thoughtful decisions, and allowing results to unfold. This doesn't eliminate uncertainty. It doesn't guarantee perfect outcomes, but it gives you a stronger foundation to navigate whatever comes next. And that, in many ways, is the real purpose behind mastering observation. Not just to see more, but to live with greater clarity and intention. Because once you truly learn how to observe, not just with your eyes, but with your mind, you begin to realize that most of what shapes your life was always visible. It was just waiting for you to notice. There comes a quiet moment, after all the practice and awareness begins to settle, when you realize that observation has changed something deeper than just how you see others. It has changed how you experience life itself. Things feel slower, not in a dull way, but in a more deliberate and controlled sense. Situations that once felt overwhelming now appear more structured. Conversations that once seemed confusing now carry clear signals. You are no longer rushing to keep up with everything around you. Instead, you are allowing things to reveal themselves at their natural pace. And in that shift, a different kind of intelligence begins to take shape. It's not loud or obvious. It doesn't rely on showing others what you know. In fact, most of the time, it goes unnoticed. But internally, there is a strong sense of clarity. You understand more than you say. You see more than you react to. And this creates a kind of quiet advantage that doesn't need to be announced. But with this clarity comes responsibility. Because once you start seeing patterns clearly, ignoring them becomes a choice. You can no longer claim that you didn't notice the warning signs, or that you were unaware of how a situation was unfolding. Awareness removes that layer of innocence. It asks you to be more honest with yourself. If something feels off and you can clearly see why, the next step is not to dismiss it, but to decide what you are going to do about it. This is where observation connects directly with personal standards. You begin to set clearer boundaries, not out of emotion, but out of understanding. You choose where to invest your time and energy more carefully. You stop overcommitting to people or situations that consistently show misalignment. And importantly, you do this without unnecessary conflict or explanation. Because when your decisions are grounded in clear observation, they don't need excessive justification. At the same time, your tolerance for noise begins to decrease. Not in a rigid or judgmental way, but in a practical sense. You become less interested in surface-level distractions, less drawn to drama, less affected by opinions that lack depth. It's not that these things disappear, it's that they lose their hold on your attention. And this creates space. Space to think more clearly. Space to focus on what actually matters. Space to respond thoughtfully instead of reacting automatically. This mental clarity is one of the most valuable outcomes of strong observation, yet it's often overlooked because it builds gradually. Another subtle change happens in how you communicate. You start choosing your words more carefully, not to impress, but to be precise. You listen more than you speak, but when you do speak, it carries weight. Because your words are not rushed or reactive, they are informed by what you've observed and understood. People may not always know why, but they begin to sense this difference. Conversations with you feel more grounded. Decisions you make appear more considered. Even your silence starts to carry meaning, because it's no longer empty, it's intentional. There is also a deeper sense of independence that develops here, not in the sense of isolating yourself, but in how you think. You become less influenced by crowd behavior, less dependent on external validation, less reactive to trends or pressure, because your understanding is no longer borrowed, it is built. You've taken the time to observe, to question, to connect patterns, and to refine your perspective. And that process creates a kind of internal stability that doesn't easily get shaken. But it's important to recognize that this is not an endpoint. Observation is not something you must. You've seen enough, your awareness starts to dull again. You fall back into assumptions. You begin to miss details. And slowly, without noticing, you return to the same patterns most people operate within. So the key is to stay engaged, to remain curious, to continue questioning what you see instead of accepting it at face value, to keep refining your ability to focus, filter, and interpret. This doesn't require constant effort, but it does require consistency. Small moments of awareness, repeated over time, are what maintain sharp observation. And perhaps the most important realization, after everything, is this: observation is not about gaining control over everything around you. It's about understanding enough to navigate wisely. You cannot predict every outcome. You cannot fully understand every person or situation. There will always be uncertainty. But with strong observation, that uncertainty becomes manageable. You make better decisions with incomplete information. You avoid obvious mistakes. You recognize opportunities earlier. And you move through life with a sense of direction, even when things are not fully clear. That is more than enough. Because in the end, the real value of observation is not in knowing everything, it's in knowing enough to act with clarity, confidence, and intention. And once you reach that point, you don't feel the need to chase answers constantly. You trust your ability to notice, to understand, and to adapt. You simply pay attention, and that changes everything. At some point, without any dramatic shift or clear milestone, you begin to notice that observation is no longer something you do, it becomes something you live through. It quietly integrates into your everyday decisions, your conversations, even your moments of silence. And what once required effort now feels almost automatic. But this stage brings a different kind of challenge, not in learning how to observe, but in knowing when to stop observing and simply experience. Because if you're not careful, heightened awareness can turn into constant analysis. You start reading into everything, dissecting every interaction, searching for patterns even when they don't matter. And instead of clarity, this creates mental fatigue. So the final refinement of observation is balance. You learn when to engage your awareness deeply, and when to let things be simple. Not every moment needs interpretation. Not every behavior carries hidden meaning. Sometimes, a conversation is just a conversation. Sometimes, a pause is just a pause. This ability to switch between focused observation and relaxed presence is what keeps your mind both sharp and at ease. And interestingly, when you stop forcing observation, it often becomes even more accurate. Because you're no longer looking for something specific, you're open to what naturally stands out. Your attention becomes more intuitive, less strained. This is where observation begins to feel almost effortless. You walk into a situation and understand its tone without consciously analyzing it. You meet someone and sense their energy without overthinking their words. You notice patterns forming without needing to track every detail. It's not guesswork. It's accumulated awareness working quietly in the background. There is also a deeper sense of calm that develops here. When you trust your ability to observe and interpret reality, you feel less urgency to control everything. You don't need to rush decisions or force clarity. You know that, given a little time and attention, things will reveal themselves. This patience becomes one of your greatest strengths. In situations where others feel pressured to react quickly, you remain steady. You take in information, you let patterns emerge, and you respond when it makes sense. This doesn't slow you down, it actually makes you more effective. Because your actions are grounded, not impulsive. At the same time, your relationship with uncertainty begins to change. Earlier, uncertainty might have felt uncomfortable, something to eliminate as quickly as possible. But now, it becomes something you can sit with. You don't need immediate answers. You don't need complete clarity before moving forward. You understand that partial information, when observed correctly, is often enough. And this gives you flexibility. You can adapt as situations evolve. You can adjust your understanding without feeling lost. You can change direction without feeling like you failed. Because your confidence is not tied to being right all the time, it's tied to your ability to observe and respond effectively. Another quiet shift happens in how you relate to people. You become less reactive, not because you're detached. That space is powerful. It allows you to choose your reactions instead of being controlled by them. It allows you to engage with people more thoughtfully, without getting pulled into unnecessary conflict or misunderstanding. And often, it leads to better outcomes, not because you are trying to control others, but because you are interacting with greater awareness. There is also a sense of quiet humility that grows alongside strong observation. The more you see, the more you realize how much there is to notice. How complex people are. How situations can shift unexpectedly. How even clear patterns can break under the right conditions. This keeps you grounded. You don't become overly confident in your interpretations. You remain open, adaptable, and willing to learn. And this mindset protects the quality of your observation over time. Because once arrogance enters the process, perception becomes distorted again. In the end, observation is less about mastering the external world and more about refining your internal clarity. It shapes how you think, how you decide, how you interact, and how you move through uncertainty. It doesn't make life predictable, but it makes it understandable. And that distinction matters. Because when you understand what's happening around you, even partially, you stop feeling lost. You stop reacting blindly. You begin to move with intention, even in complex or unclear situations. That's where real confidence comes from. Not from having all the answers, but from knowing that you can notice what matters, interpret it with care, and adjust when needed. And once that becomes your default way of engaging with the world, something subtle but powerful happens. You stop looking for shortcuts. You no longer need quick tricks or surface-level techniques to navigate life. You rely on something deeper, something more stable. You rely on your ability to see clearly. And in a world where most people are distracted, reactive, and overwhelmed by noise, that alone becomes a rare and valuable advantage, one that continues to grow quietly every time you choose to simply pay attention. In the end, what makes observation truly powerful is not how much it helps you understand the world, but how quietly it reshapes the way you live within it. There's no sudden transformation, no dramatic moment where everything changes at once. Instead, it unfolds gradually, almost unnoticed, until one day you realize that you are no longer reacting to life the way you used to. Situations that once pulled you in emotionally now feel more manageable. You don't get carried away as easily by other people's moods, opinions, or pressure, not because you've become distant, but because you can see what's happening beneath the surface. You recognize patterns early, and that recognition gives you space to choose how you respond. And that space is where control quietly begins. It's not control over others, and not even full control over outcomes. It's control over your own direction. Your decisions become less influenced by impulse and more guided by understanding. You begin to act with a sense of timing, knowing when to step in and when to hold back. This changes the way you approach opportunities as well. Before, you might have chased what looked appealing on the surface: quick results, visible rewards, immediate validation. But with stronger observation, you start looking deeper. You pay attention to sustainability, to consistency, to what happens behind the scenes. You begin to ask different questions. Not just, what is this offering me right now, but, what pattern does this follow over time? Not just, how does this look, but, how does this behave when tested? These questions lead you toward better decisions, not because they guarantee success, but because they reduce unnecessary risk. There is also a noticeable shift in how you deal with mistakes. Earlier, mistakes might have felt like setbacks or failures. But now, they become part of your observation process. You look at what happened, not just on the surface, but in terms of patterns. What did you miss? What signals were there that you overlooked? What assumptions influenced your decision? This kind of reflection sharpens your awareness even further. Instead of repeating the same errors, you begin to refine your perception. You adjust your focus. You become more sensitive to certain signals, more cautious in certain situations. Over time, this creates a feedback loop where your observation continuously improves itself. And yet, despite all this growth, there is a simplicity that remains at the core of it. Observation, at its highest level, is not complicated. It is simply the act of being, needing to distort it. You accept patterns as they are, without forcing them to fit what you want to believe. You allow situations to reveal themselves without rushing to conclusions. This honesty is what gives observation its strength. Because it's easy to observe when the truth is comfortable. It's much harder when what you see challenges your expectations, your preferences, or your existing beliefs. But that is exactly where observation becomes most valuable. It pushes you toward reality, even when reality is inconvenient. And living in alignment with reality, rather than illusion or assumption, is what leads to better outcomes over time. Not perfect outcomes, but more consistent, more grounded ones. Another quiet benefit begins to show up in how you experience time. When you are not constantly reacting or rushing, time feels less compressed. You are not jumping from one thought to another, from one distraction to the next. Your attention is more stable, more anchored in the present moment. And this creates a sense of ease. You still deal with challenges. You still face uncertainty, but you are not overwhelmed by them in the same way. You approach them with a clearer mind, a steadier perspective. You take in what's happening, you understand it as best as you can, and then you decide your next step. Nothing feels unnecessarily urgent, and in that calm pace, your decisions tend to improve naturally. Perhaps the most subtle, yet most important shift, is how you begin to trust yourself. Not blindly, and not with overconfidence, but with a quiet assurance that you can handle what comes your way. Because you know how to observe. You know how to gather information without rushing. You know how to interpret patterns without forcing conclusions. You know how to adjust when new information appears. This doesn't make you immune to mistakes, but it makes you resilient to them. You recover faster. You learn more effectively. You adapt more smoothly. And all of this happens without needing external validation or constant reassurance. At this stage, observation is no longer just a skill, it becomes part of your mindset. It influences how you think, how you act, how you relate to others, and how you navigate the unknown. It works quietly in the background, guiding your attention, shaping your understanding, and supporting your decisions. And perhaps that's why it feels so powerful. Not because it gives you control over everything, but because it gives you clarity within anything. No matter the situation, no matter the complexity, you always have the ability to pause, to notice, and to understand just a little more than before. And that small difference, repeated over time, becomes the foundation of a life that feels more intentional, more stable, and more. What becomes clear after all of this is something most people overlook for a long time. The real value of observation is not in what it adds to your life, but in what it quietly removes. It removes confusion where there used to be overthinking. It removes unnecessary reactions where there used to be impulsiveness. It removes illusions that once felt comfortable but were quietly leading you in the wrong direction. And what remains is something much simpler, but far more useful: clarity. Not perfect clarity, not complete certainty, but enough understanding to move forward without constantly second-guessing yourself. Enough awareness to recognize when something aligns and when it doesn't. Enough perspective to step back when needed and step in when it matters. This is where observation begins to feel less like a skill and more like a foundation. It supports everything else you do. The way you make decisions becomes more grounded. You are no longer relying solely on what sounds good or feels right in the moment. You are paying attention to what has consistently proven to be true. You are looking at how things behave over time, not just how they appear at first glance. And this creates a kind of stability that doesn't depend on external conditions. Even when situations are uncertain, even when outcomes are unclear, you don't feel completely lost. You may not have all the answers, but you have a process, a way of engaging with reality that helps you navigate it with some level of confidence. At the same time, you begin to notice how rare this way of thinking actually is. Most people are still operating on quick judgments, emotional reactions, and surface-level impressions. They jump to conclusions, they overlook patterns, they ignore subtle signals that don't fit their expectations. And because of that, they often find themselves surprised by outcomes that, in hindsight, were predictable. But when you've trained yourself to observe properly, fewer things catch you off guard. Not because you can predict everything, but because you are paying attention to the right signals early enough. You see the direction things are heading, even if you don't know exactly how they will unfold. This doesn't make you detached from life, it makes you more engaged in a deeper way. You are not just reacting to events as they happen. You are understanding the structure behind them. You are seeing how small details connect to larger patterns. You are recognizing how decisions, behaviors, and environments influence outcomes over time. And this level of engagement changes how you move through the world. You become more deliberate, not slow in a hesitant way, but precise. You don't waste as much energy on things that don't matter. You don't get pulled into distractions as easily. You are able to focus your attention where it actually makes a difference. And this efficiency, though subtle, compounds over time. Small, well-informed decisions begin to stack up. Avoided mistakes create space for better opportunities. Clearer understanding leads to better timing. And gradually, without any dramatic shifts, your overall direction improves. There is also a deeper sense of acceptance that comes with strong observation. You begin to see things as they are, not just as you wish they were. You recognize limitations, in people, in systems, even in yourself, without needing to resist them constantly. And this acceptance doesn't make you passive. It makes you realistic. Because once you understand the boundaries of a situation, you can work within them more effectively. You stop trying to force outcomes that are unlikely. You stop expecting consistency where there is none. You stop investing energy into patterns that have already shown you their nature, and instead, you align your actions with what is actually possible. This alignment reduces frustration in a way that feels almost surprising. Not because life becomes easier, but because you are no longer working against reality. You are moving with it, adjusting as needed, making decisions based on what you've clearly seen rather than what you hope might happen. And this brings a certain kind of calm. Not the absence of challenges, but the absence of unnecessary struggle. At the same time, you remain open, because observation, at its core, is not rigid. It doesn't lock you into fixed beliefs. It encourages you to keep noticing, to keep updating your understanding as new information appears. This keeps your thinking flexible. You don't become stuck in old patterns or outdated assumptions. You evolve with what you observe. You refine your perspective continuously. And this ability to adapt becomes one of your greatest strengths in a world that is constant, not a limitation. It's what keeps the process alive. It keeps you engaged, curious, and aware. And perhaps that's the most valuable part of all. Because when you truly learn how to observe, you don't just improve your decisions or your understanding, you change your relationship with the world itself. You stop moving through it unconsciously. You start seeing it clearly. And once you see clearly, even if only a little more than before, you begin to realize that most of the answers you were searching for were never hidden. They were always there, in plain sight. You just needed to learn how to notice them. And after everything settles, after all the techniques, refinements, and quiet realizations, you begin to notice something almost unexpected. Observation doesn't just change how you see the world, it changes what you value within it. The things that once felt important start to lose their weight. Constant noise, endless opinions, surface level success, quick validation, they begin to feel less meaningful, almost distracting. Not because they disappear, but because you can now see through them. You understand how often appearances are constructed, how frequently words are chosen to influence rather than reveal, how easily attention is pulled toward what is loud instead of what is true. And naturally, your focus shifts. You start valuing consistency over intensity, depth over display, quiet reliability over impressive beginnings. You pay more attention to what holds over time rather than what stands out in the moment. This shift is subtle, but it changes the direction of your decisions. You become less attracted to what simply looks good and more interested in what actually works. Whether it's people, opportunities, or environments, you begin to ask yourself a different kind of question. Not, is this appealing right now, but, does this show a pattern I can trust? And that question filters a lot. It removes distractions that once seemed important. It narrows your focus to things that have substance. And over time, this leads to more stable outcomes, not because you are trying harder, but because you are choosing more carefully. There is also a noticeable change in how you handle influence. Earlier, it was easy to be swayed by confident voices, strong opinions, or popular perspectives. But with stronger observation, you start to look beyond delivery and into structure. You examine whether the reasoning holds, whether the behavior aligns with the message, whether the outcomes match the claims. And this makes you more independent in your thinking. You're not rejecting ideas automatically, but you're not accepting them blindly either. You're evaluating them based on what you can observe consistently, not just what sounds convincing. This independence doesn't isolate you, it grounds you. It allows you to engage with different perspectives without losing your own clarity. You can listen, consider, and even adapt, but you're not easily pulled off course by surface-level persuasion. At the same time, your patience with outcomes deepens. You no longer expect immediate results from every action. You understand that most meaningful changes follow patterns that take time to unfold. Whether it's building trust, developing skill, or creating something of value, you recognize that consistency matters more than speed. And because of that, you're less likely to abandon things prematurely. You give processes the time they need, but you also remain observant enough to notice when something truly isn't working. This balance prevents both impulsiveness and stubbornness. You don't quit too early, and you don't hold on too long without reason. Another quiet transformation happens in how you deal with uncertainty about the future. Instead of trying to predict exact outcomes, you begin to focus on direction. You observe current patterns and ask where they are likely leading. You don't need perfect certainty, you just need a reasonable sense of trajectory. And that's often enough to make better decisions. Because life rarely offers complete clarity in advance, but it almost always provides signals. Subtle, sometimes easy to miss, but present. And when you're trained to notice them, you can adjust your path before problems fully develop. This reduces risk in a very practical way. Not by avoiding all mistakes, but by catching them earlier. Not by controlling everything, but by staying aware enough to respond in time. there is also a deeper level of self-respect that begins to form. When you consistently observe, reflect, and adjust, you build trust in your own process. You stop relying on guesswork or external approval to feel confident in your decisions. You know that on direction, on what continues to prove itself over time. And this steadiness becomes one of your strongest advantages. Because while others are constantly shifting based on immediate feedback, you remain anchored in a deeper understanding. You adjust when necessary, but you don't lose your sense of direction. In the end, observation leads you to a very simple but powerful place. You stop chasing clarity in complicated ways. You stop looking for hidden shortcuts or secret formulas. You begin to rely on something far more consistent: your ability to notice what is actually happening, to interpret it carefully, and to respond with intention. It doesn't make you perfect. It doesn't remove all uncertainty. But it gives you something far more valuable than that. It gives you a way to move forward without being blind. And once you have that, you don't need to rush, you don't need to force, and you don't need to constantly question every step. You simply stay aware. You keep observing. And you allow that awareness to guide you, quietly and steadily, through whatever comes next. In the end, when everything has been understood and quietly absorbed, observation reveals itself not as a technique, not as a strategy, but as a way of being that simplifies life rather than complicates it. You no longer feel the need to constantly figure everything out. There is less urgency in your thinking, less pressure to reach immediate conclusions, less attachment to being right all the time. Instead, there is a steady awareness, one that allows you to move forward without forcing clarity where it hasn't fully formed yet. And strangely, this makes your understanding more accurate, not less. Because when you stop chasing quick answers, you start allowing better ones to emerge naturally. You give situations enough space to reveal their true nature. You let people show who they are through patterns, not promises. You let outcomes develop instead of trying to predict them too early. This patience becomes a quiet advantage. While others rush, react, and often misjudge, you remain grounded. You take in what's happening, you connect it with what you've seen before, and you act when it makes sense, not too early, not too late. And this sense of timing, refined through observation, becomes one of the most valuable skills you carry. It's not something you can easily explain, but it shows in your decisions. You enter situations with better awareness. You avoid unnecessary risks. You recognize when to commit and when to step back. And over time, this leads to outcomes that feel less random and more intentional. At the same time, you begin to realize that not everything requires your attention. Earlier, it was easy to get pulled into every distraction, every opinion, every passing moment that demanded a reaction. But now, you naturally filter these things out, not by force, but by understanding their lack of importance. You conserve your energy. You focus on what has meaning, what shows consistency, what aligns with your direction. And by doing less of what doesn't matter, you create more space for what does. This simplicity is not about doing less in a passive way, it's about doing less of the wrong things. And that distinction matters. Because as your observation sharpens, you become more selective. You don't just act because something is available. You act because it makes sense within a pattern you trust. This applies to people, to opportunities, to decisions of all kinds. And with this selectiveness comes a certain level of peace. You are no longer constantly questioning whether you are on the right path. You are not comparing yourself endlessly to others. You are not reacting to every shift in your environment. You are observing, adjusting, and continuing forward. Quietly, there is also a deeper acceptance that settles in. You understand that not everything can be controlled, predicted, or even fully understood. Some situations will remain uncertain. Some people will remain inconsistent. Some outcomes will not match your expectations. But instead of resisting this, you work with it. You observe what is within your reach. You make decisions based on what is clear. And you remain flexible enough to adapt when things change. This reduces friction in a way that feels almost effortless. You're not constantly fighting reality. You're aligning with it, as best as you can, with the information you have. And this alignment creates a kind of quiet confidence. Not the loud, visible kind that seeks validation, but a steady inner trust. You know that whatever situation you face, you have the ability to observe it, understand it, and respond thoughtfully. That is enough. They react too fast to understand. They focus on what stands out instead of what actually matters. But when you've developed observation, you operate differently. You slow down just enough to see. You pause just enough to understand. You choose just enough to stay aligned with what you've learned. And over time, this way of living compounds. Small improvements in perception lead to better decisions. Better decisions lead to more stable outcomes. And those outcomes reinforce your trust in the process. Not a dramatic transformation, but a steady evolution. And perhaps that's the most honest way to understand it. Observation doesn't promise perfection. It doesn't remove uncertainty or guarantee success, but it gives you something far more practical, a reliable way to navigate complexity with clarity, a way to move through life without being constantly misled by appearances, a way to stay grounded when everything around you feels uncertain. And once you truly understand that, you stop searching for something more complicated, because you realize that the ability to notice, to think, and to respond with awareness was always enough. It was never about learning more, it was about seeing better. And once you learn to do that, even quietly, even imperfectly, you begin to move through life in a way that feels more intentional, more stable, and ultimately, more real. And after all of this, something very quiet but deeply important begins to settle within you. You stop trying to force life into clarity, and instead, you allow clarity to come to you. This is not passive. It's not about waiting or doing nothing. It's about moving with awareness instead of urgency. Earlier, there was always a subtle pressure to figure things out quickly, to make the right decision fast, to avoid uncertainty at all costs. But now, you understand that rushing often distorts what you're trying to see, so you give things space. Not too much, not endlessly, but enough for patterns to reveal themselves, enough for behavior to repeat, enough for signals to become consistent rather than accidental. And in that space, your understanding becomes more reliable. You're no longer chasing every possibility. You're watching what actually unfolds. You're not trying to predict everything in advance. You're observing direction, adjusting as needed, and staying aligned with what continues to prove itself. This makes your approach to life feel lighter. Not because things are easier, but because you're no longer carrying the weight of constant overthinking. You're not trying to control every outcome. You're not reacting to every small shift. You're focused on what matters, and you're letting the rest pass. And this creates a kind of mental clarity that is hard to describe until you experience it. There's less noise inside your head, fewer conflicting thoughts, fewer unnecessary doubts. You still think deeply, but your thinking is more structured, more intentional. You're not just thinking more, you're thinking better. At the same time, your relationship with mistakes becomes even more refined. You no longer see them as disruptions to your path. You see them as part of the observation process itself. Every mistake carries information, not just about what went wrong, but about what you missed, what you assumed, or what you overlooked. And instead of reacting emotionally, you examine it calmly. You ask yourself what signals were present, what patterns were incomplete, what details didn't receive enough attention. And through that process, your observation sharpens even further. This turns mistakes into a kind of feedback loop, not something to avoid at all costs, but something to learn from without losing direction. And over time, this reduces the fear of being wrong, because you trust your ability to adjust. There is also a noticeable shift in how you experience other people. You become less judgmental, but more discerning. You don't rush to label or categorize people based on limited interactions. You allow them time to show who they are. But at the same time, once patterns become clear, you don't ignore them. You accept what you see. This balance is important, because it prevents you from being overly trusting, but also from becoming unnecessarily skeptical. You're open, but aware. You're engaged, but not naive. And this makes your relationships more grounded. You're not constantly surprised by people's behavior, because you've been paying attention. You're not holding unrealistic expectations, because you've observed what is consistent. And because of that, your interactions become smoother, more predictable in a practical sense. There is less friction. Another quiet, a need to feel certain. But now, you recognize that partial understanding, when observed carefully, is often enough. You don't wait for perfect information. You gather what you can, you observe patterns, you make a decision, and you remain flexible. If new information appears, you adjust. This keeps you moving. You're not stuck in analysis, and you're not acting blindly. You're operating somewhere in between, a place where awareness and action support each other. And this balance is what makes observation truly practical. Because without action, observation stays theoretical. And without observation, action becomes reckless. But when both work together, your decisions become both thoughtful and effective. As this way of thinking deepens, something else becomes clear. You no longer feel the need to prove your understanding to others. You don't need to explain every insight or justify every decision. You're comfortable with what you see, even if others don't immediately recognize it. And this removes a subtle but constant pressure. You're not seeking validation for your perception. You're relying on it, quietly. And this quiet confidence allows you to move through situations with less resistance. You're not arguing with reality. You're not trying to convince others of what you've already understood. You're simply acting in alignment with it. In the end, observation leads you to a place that feels both simple and strong. You are present. You are aware. You are responsive, but not reactive. And from that position, life becomes less about trying to control everything, and more about navigating with clarity. Not perfectly, not completely, but consistently. And that consistency, built on the simple act of noticing what is real, becomes one of the most reliable advantages you can carry forward, no matter where you go or what you face next. And eventually, you arrive at a place where nothing about observation feels like effort anymore. It becomes quiet, almost invisible in your daily life, yet it shapes nearly everything you do. You don't wake up thinking about observing. You don't consciously remind yourself to pay attention. And still, you notice. You understand. You adjust. It's as if your mind has learned a new rhythm, one that is not rushed, not scattered, but steady and deliberate. And within that rhythm, there is a kind of ease. You move through conversations without trying too hard to interpret every word, yet you still pick up what matters. You enter situations without overanalyzing every detail, yet you sense the direction they are heading. You make decisions without forcing certainty, yet they feel grounded. This ease is not carelessness. It is refinement. It comes from repeated exposure to patterns, from learning what matters and what doesn't, from slowly building trust in your ability to see clearly without needing to control everything. And that trust becomes your anchor. Because no matter how complex a situation appears, you know you can rely on your awareness to guide you. You may not understand everything immediately, but you understand enough to begin. And that is often all you need. There is also a quiet detachment that begins to form, not from people or life itself, but from unnecessary involvement in things that don't align with your understanding. You don't feel the need to engage in every debate, respond to every opinion, or react to every situation that invites your attention. You choose more carefully. And this choice is not driven by avoidance, but by clarity. You can see which interactions are meaningful and which are simply noise. You can tell when something deserves your energy and when it's better to step back. And over time, this protects your focus in a way that feels natural rather than forced. Another shift happens in how you experience progress. Earlier, progress might have felt tied to visible results, achievements, recognition, clear milestones. But now, you begin to value something less obvious but far more stable: improvement in perception. You notice that you're catching things earlier than before, understanding situations faster, making fewer avoidable mistakes, adjusting more smoothly when things change. And this kind of progress, though subtle, compounds in a powerful way. Because better perception leads to better decisions, and better decisions shape better outcomes over time. Not instantly, not dramatically, but consistently. There is also a deeper sense of alignment that develops between what you see and how you act. You're no longer ignoring your own observations to fit expectations or avoid discomfort. When you notice something clearly, you take it seriously. You let it influence you. Creates a kind of internal stability that is hard to disrupt. Even when things don't go as planned, you don't feel completely thrown off. You adjust. You reobserve. You continue. Because your process remains intact. At the same time, you become more comfortable with the idea that not everything needs to be resolved immediately. Some situations take time to clarify. Some patterns need repetition before they become visible. Some answers only appear after enough observation has taken place. And instead of resisting this, you work with it. You stay attentive without becoming impatient. You remain engaged without forcing conclusions. And this patience often leads to insights that would have been missed in a more rushed approach. There is also a growing sense of respect for reality as it is. Not as you want it to be, not as it appears on the surface, but as it consistently shows itself through patterns and behavior. You stop arguing with what is clearly in front of you. You stop holding on to expectations that don't match what you've observed. And this acceptance simplifies your decisions. Because once you see something clearly, the next step becomes obvious, even if it's not always easy. In the end, observation leads you to a very grounded way of living. You are not constantly searching for answers, yet you keep finding them. You are not trying to control everything, yet you navigate effectively. You are not reacting to every moment, yet you remain fully engaged with what matters. And this balance, between awareness and action, between patience and decisiveness, between understanding and acceptance, becomes the foundation of how you move through life. It doesn't draw attention, it doesn't need recognition, but it works, quietly, consistently, and reliably. And once you reach this point, you realize something simple but powerful: the ability to observe was never just about seeing the world more clearly. It was about learning how to live within it with clarity. And that, more than anything else, is what stays with you. And somewhere along the way, without any clear moment marking the transition, you begin to notice that life feels less like something you are trying to figure out, and more like something you are steadily understanding. There is less friction in your thinking. You are no longer constantly caught between doubt and impulse, between rushing forward and holding back. Instead, there is a smoother flow in how you process things. You see, you consider, and then you move, not perfectly, but with enough clarity that you are not second-guessing every step. This is where observation becomes deeply personal. It's no longer just about understanding others or reading situations. It's about how you relate to your own thoughts, your own reactions, your own direction. You begin to notice your internal patterns just as clearly as external ones. When you feel hesitation, you don't immediately resist it, you observe it. When you feel confident, you don't blindly trust it, you examine it. When something feels unclear, you don't rush to label it, you allow it to develop. And this creates a kind of internal balance. You are not controlled by your emotions, but you are not disconnected from them either. You recognize them as signals, not commands. You allow them to inform your awareness without letting them dictate your decisions. This subtle shift changes how you experience challenges. Instead of reacting immediately, you create a small space, just enough to notice what is actually happening. What triggered this? What pattern does this follow? Is this a familiar situation, or something new? And in that small space, your response becomes more thoughtful. This doesn't mean you become slow or hesitant. In fact, over time, you often become quicker, but your speed comes from clarity, not impulse. You've seen enough patterns, both in the world and within yourself, that you don't need to start from zero each time. You recognize, you adjust, and you act. There is also a deeper sense of responsibility that grows here, because once you can clearly observe your own patterns, it becomes harder to ignore them. You see the habits that hold you back. You notice the situations you tend to repeat. You recognize the choices that lead to the same outcomes. And this awareness asks something from you. It asks you to be honest, not harsh, not critical, but honest enough to admit what is working and what isn't. Honest enough to adjust your behavior when needed. Honest enough to stop blaming external factors for patterns that you can clearly see within your control. This kind of honesty is not always comfortable, but it is powerful, because it gives you leverage. Instead of fear, small adjustments begin to shift your direction. Not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily. Another quiet change appears in how you deal with uncertainty about yourself. Earlier, there may have been a need to define everything clearly: who you are, what you want, where you're going. But now, you become more comfortable with partial clarity. You don't need to have everything figured out. You observe your own patterns, your interests, your responses to different situations. You allow your direction to emerge from what consistently feels aligned, rather than forcing a fixed identity too early. And this creates flexibility. You can evolve without feeling lost. You can change direction without feeling like you've failed. Because your sense of self is not rigid, it is informed by ongoing observation. At the same time, your confidence becomes quieter but stronger. It is no longer based on external outcomes or validation. It is based on your ability to see clearly, to think carefully, and to adjust when necessary. You trust your process. Even when things are uncertain, even when outcomes are not guaranteed, you know that you can rely on your awareness to guide you forward. And this trust reduces a lot of unnecessary stress. You're not constantly worrying about making the perfect decision. You're focused on making a reasonable one, based on what you've observed, and then refining as you go. This makes progress feel more natural, less forced, less pressured, more aligned with reality. And perhaps one of the most meaningful shifts is this: you begin to feel less like you are reacting to life, and more like you are participating in it consciously. You are still influenced by circumstances, still affected by people and events, but you are not moving blindly through them. You are aware of what is happening, both around you and within you. And that awareness gives you a sense of direction. Not a rigid path, but a steady orientation. You know how to pause when needed. You know how to move when it makes sense. You know how to adjust when things change. And this ability, though quiet, becomes one of the most reliable strengths you carry. Because no matter where you are, no matter what situation you face, you always have access to the same simple tool: your ability to notice, to understand, and to respond. And in a world that often feels complex and unpredictable, that simplicity becomes something you can depend on, not because it solves everything, but because it keeps you grounded in what is real. And from that place, you can always find your next step. At this stage, something almost effortless begins to define the way you move through life. You stop searching for certainty, and you start trusting clarity as it appears. It's a small distinction, but it changes everything. Certainty demands complete answers. It pushes you to eliminate all doubt before you act. And in most real situations, that level of certainty is simply not available. But clarity is different. It doesn't require everything to be known, it only requires that enough is understood to take the next step. And through observation, you learn to recognize that enough. You don't wait endlessly for perfect conditions. You don't rush blindly into decisions either. You move when the signal is clear enough, when the pattern has shown itself just enough times, when your understanding feels grounded rather than forced. This creates a rhythm in your life that feels both steady and adaptable. You are not stuck in hesitation, but you are also not driven by impulse. You are moving in response to what you see, not what you assume. And that makes your decisions more aligned with reality, even when that reality is still unfolding. There is also a noticeable shift in how you experience pressure. Earlier, pressure may have pushed you into quick reactions, saying yes too soon, making decisions too fast, or following paths that didn't fully make sense. But now, you see pressure for what it is, a force that often tries to override careful observation. And because you recognize it, you're less controlled by it. You don't ignore urgency when it's real, but you don't confuse urgency with importance either. You give yourself just enough space to observe before acting. And that small pause often protects you from decisions that would have led in the wrong direction. Over time, this becomes one of your quiet safeguards. You are harder to rush, harder to mislead, harder to influence in ways that don't align with what you've seen. Not because you resist everything, but because you filter more carefully. And this filtering extends into almost every area of your life. You become more selective with your decide. This selectiveness is not about limitation, it's about precision. You are focusing your time and energy where it has the highest chance of meaningful return. And by doing that, you reduce unnecessary distractions that once diluted your attention. There is also a deeper sense of calm confidence that continues to grow. You no longer feel the need to constantly evaluate whether you are doing the right thing. You understand that right and wrong are often revealed over time, through patterns and outcomes. So instead of trying to predict perfectly, you focus on observing carefully and adjusting as needed. This removes a lot of internal pressure. You are not trying to control the future, you are preparing yourself to respond to it intelligently. And that preparation is built on awareness. Another important shift is how you relate to complexity. Earlier, complex situations might have felt overwhelming, filled with too many variables to understand clearly. But now, you approach complexity differently. You break it down through observation. You look for patterns, for repeated behaviors, for consistent signals. You don't try to understand everything at once. You understand enough to begin, and then you refine your understanding as more information appears. This makes even complicated situations more manageable, because instead of being paralyzed by the unknown, you are engaging with it step by step, guided by what you can clearly see. There is also a subtle but powerful change in your expectations. You stop expecting perfection, from yourself, from others, from situations. You understand that inconsistency is part of reality, that people will not always act predictably, that outcomes will not always match your plans. And instead of resisting this, you account for it. You observe how often something works, not whether it works perfectly. You look at direction, not isolated results. And this gives you a more realistic foundation for your decisions. It makes you both more patient and more precise. And as all of this continues to settle into your way of thinking, something becomes very clear. You are no longer dependent on external clarity. You don't need everything to be explained to you. You don't need constant guidance or reassurance. You have developed an internal way of understanding, one that relies on what you observe, how you interpret it, and how you respond. And that independence is powerful, because it stays with you, regardless of the situation. No matter where you go, no matter what you face, you carry the same ability to notice, to think, to adjust. And in the end, that's what makes observation so valuable. It doesn't give you fixed answers. It gives you a way to find them, quietly, consistently, and in a way that adapts to whatever life places in front of you. And once you truly understand that, you stop looking for something more complicated, because you realize that the clarity you were searching for was never out of reach. It was always waiting in the simple act of paying attention. At this point, everything becomes quieter, but also clearer than it has ever been. Not because the world has simplified, but because your way of engaging with it has changed in a fundamental way. You are no longer trying to extract meaning from every single moment. Instead, you allow meaning to reveal itself where it truly exists. This is a subtle but powerful shift. Earlier, there was a tendency to analyze constantly, to search for hidden signals in everything, to make sense of even what didn't need interpretation. But now, you recognize that not all moments carry equal weight. Some things are just passing noise. And because you can see that, you stop giving unnecessary attention to what doesn't deserve it. This frees up your awareness. You are no longer mentally occupied by distractions that once felt important. Your attention becomes more intentional, more selective, more aligned with what actually influences outcomes over time. And in that selectiveness, your clarity deepens. You start noticing that the most meaningful insights often come from very ordinary moments: a repeated behavior, a small inconsistency, a subtle change in tone, a pattern that slowly becomes impossible to ignore. Nothing dramatic, but highly informative. And because you are no longer overwhelmed by everything else, you can actually see these things when they appear. There is also a sense of steadiness that becomes part of your presence. You are not easily thrown off by sudden changes or unexpected situations. Not because you anticipate everything, but because you are used to observing before reacting. You trust that even if something is unclear at first, they sense that you are not reacting blindly, that you are seeing something beyond the surface. And this changes the dynamic of your interactions. You are less likely to be pulled into unnecessary conflicts, less likely to be influenced by pressure or emotion in the moment. You respond in a way that feels measured, even in situations that are not. There is also a deeper sense of trust that develops, not just in yourself, but in the process of observation itself. You begin to see that clarity doesn't come from forcing answers, but from allowing patterns to form. That understanding doesn't come from thinking harder, but from noticing more accurately. And because of that, you stop overworking your mind. You don't feel the need to constantly solve everything. You observe, you reflect when needed, and you let time play its role in revealing what is not immediately obvious. This creates a kind of mental space that feels calm but alert. You are relaxed, but not unaware. Focused, but not tense. Engaged, but not overwhelmed. And in this state, your decisions tend to improve naturally. Not because you are trying harder, but because you are interfering less with your own perception. Another important realization begins to settle in here. You understand that observation is not about gaining an advantage over others, it's about reducing your own blind spots. It's about seeing where you might be mistaken, noticing where your assumptions don't match reality, catching the moments where your perspective needs adjustment. And this humility keeps your awareness sharp, because the moment you believe you've fully understood everything is the moment you stop observing properly. You start relying on conclusions instead of continuing to notice. But when you stay open, when you keep observing without becoming rigid, your understanding continues to evolve. There is also a quiet sense of alignment that becomes more consistent. You are not constantly pulled in different directions by conflicting thoughts or external influences. You see what makes sense, and you move accordingly. You see what doesn't, and you step back without overcomplicating it. This simplicity is not a lack of depth, it is the result of clarity. You are not simplifying reality. You are removing unnecessary confusion from how you engage with it, and that makes everything feel more manageable. Even when situations are complex, your approach remains steady. You observe what matters, ignore what doesn't, and move step by step based on what becomes clear. No rushing, no forcing, no unnecessary resistance, just consistent awareness. And in the end, this is what observation quietly gives you. Not perfection, not control over everything, but a reliable way to stay grounded in reality, no matter how situations change. A way to see clearly enough to move forward. A way to adjust without losing direction. A way to remain calm while still being fully engaged. And once this becomes part of how you live, you realize something very simple. You don't need to chase clarity anymore. You just need to keep noticing.